Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Love of Fishing podcast. I'm your host, Lyle Gator, and today I'm joined by who may be our regular co-host, Victor Papaiz.
I'm
He's
a fan of
back.
that. Yeah.
He's back, and today we are discussing something that's been on my mind for a while. It's talking about Chinook salmon in Lake Ontario, and more broadly, just the fish population in Lake Ontario and what's going on. Victor's here. He's in Kingston again, and he did earn the title of not just a bass guy.
This is true. Worked hard for that as well.
He worked very hard for that. So he's back. He's going to give his input. Victor is able to offer some questions through my rambling and my discussion that I think many people would have. And that's sort of the goal. Some backstory here. I've been a representative on the Fisheries Management Zone Council for Zone 20, which is Lake Ontario, for the past 2 years. And I think it's time to share my thoughts on how things are going. I recently attended the Lower Lakes meeting where scientists studying a variety of topics came and spoke on research that they've completed. And it all had to do with Lake Ontario, from the food web to the numbers of fish caught in creel surveys, bait fish reports, not just salmon, everything. A lot of topics, a lot of discussion at this Lower Lakes meeting. And it was incredible. There's a lot of really smart people doing a lot of really, really good work out there. And when I get into my discussion, I do not want to belittle them or to say that they're not doing a good job. I think that the scientists are doing a fantastic job. And I think that there is a genuine care out there to support our fishery. But I do think that it's time that we as anglers voice our frustrations when we have them. And without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Victor to the podcast today.
Yeah. Feel free to voice some frustrations. I assume we're going to be talking a lot about salmon specifically. I've done a fair deal of salmon fishing, not nearly as much as you. I haven't observed the same catch trends that you've obviously observed, heard some anecdotal evidence of it. But as far as stocking in the lake generally goes, I've fished a lot of steelhead, fished a lot of brown trout, a lot of lake trout, and you'd be surprised as to what other species are stocked and what other species have massive scientific initiatives behind them. For example, I was reading today about the huge studies pertaining just to bloater in the eastern basin of Lake Ontario, which is kind of like a Cisco, more of a bait fish. Massive input from the scientific community with government funding to examine the bloater population, because that's just another part of that food web that, though your average angler and maybe even citizen might not even know what a bloater is, it's vitally important to everything going on in the lake. And the good thing is scientists know this, the government knows this. So even though a lot of effort is put in indirectly into maintaining the fisheries we have in Lake Ontario, that doesn't mean people aren't working really hard.
It's a great point.
Cause.
That's great point. Part of my discussion that I really want to drive home is really about what you just mentioned about it's not always the sheer number of fish that get stocked. I get a lot of people talking to me when it comes to this topic, and they always say, we need to put more fish in the lake because I'm not catching as many as I used to. And it's an interesting thing to say, because while I don't disagree that you may be catching fewer fish and your angling experience may be less than what you hope it could be, but the reason why that's happening may not be because numbers got cut by 5 or 10%. It may be because something happened to the bloaters, or something happened to the microscopic plankton, or whatever it is, that it's sort of like the big underlying thing. So
100%
part of my discussion today is actually to encourage people not to die on the mountain of pushing for more fish. And this has been the biggest discussion. I know the Americans go absolutely nuts when on their side their science tells them to cut fish. Guys, it's more complicated than that. It is. And, when we have this discussion today, I'm going to highlight some things that I've recently heard from all of these different researchers that are talking about all of these different levels of the lake. And to really understand the whole picture, I think it's vital that people have access to the information about this. Fishermen are talkative people when they want to be. They're very secretive when they don't. But if we can build a culture of transparency between the science that's going on that is rooting to help us, that they're on our side, and the anglers in understanding this information, I think that really is where we start to see this understanding built. First thing that go ahead.
I have a couple points there.
Yeah.
The first, just to summarize that simply, is it doesn't matter how many salmon or lake trout you put in the lake if there's no bait fish for them to eat. They're not going to grow to a catchable size. They're going to be unhealthy, and that adding more fish when the system can't support it is going to be detrimental. You're not going to catch more fish, even if you're stocking more fish that don't have anything to eat. And secondly, as far as the scientific transparency goes, I am shocked that not more anglers are scientifically literate or looking at scientific literature to educate their fishing. There was a great paper I was just reading. It was acoustic telemetry on burbot. And what they were able to do, they tracked these burbot through smaller water bodies. They had sensors in them that would allow them to know basically where these burbot were in the lake at all times, as well as what depth they were occupying. And what they found was, like clockwork, every single day, they had the exact same diel movements. So during the daylight hours, they were in about 20 meters of depth. And during the nighttime hours, you see them move right up on top of these humps in 10 meters or less, and then right back down as soon as the sun comes up. So a lot of guys say, yeah, like fish burbot at night because that's when they're easier to catch. Well, that's definitely true because that's when they're on these shallow humps. But during the nighttime, you can still catch them. You just have to know they're in the deeper mud flats.
Right.
And a lot of guys know this just because they fish a lot. They talk to other guys that fish, but you can just go and read that. There's these amazing published articles that show you exactly the trends that a lot of fishermen talk about anecdotally. There's evidence backing it up for so many different species. And it's just out there to read. I'll admit a lot of the stuff isn't particularly digestible, but that is somewhere where science is definitely improving, as people are getting better at scientific communication because programs are finally stressing that. But it'd be a great asset to any fisherman, especially people that do or target species that are well studied, like salmon or other salmonids in the Great Lakes. Just look at some of the studies on them. There was another one on Lake Erie looking at the walleye spawn. They did a similar thing where they knew where, I think there were like 400 walleye tagged in this study, and they were looking at where and when they spawned and how it was different between males and females. They even say in the papers which humps and shoals they were finding these walleye on, the exact weeks of the year where the most fish were on these humps. My gosh, if I was a walleye fisherman in the western basin of Lake Erie, I can tell you exactly which weeks I'd be on which humps, which is not the point of the science at all. But as an angler, my gosh, you do some of that reading and you can plan your fishing trips pretty accordingly.
Absolutely. It is interesting with the salmonids because they are pelagic and they move with the temperature, they move with the wind, not to the same. Walleye don't do that to the same degree, or maybe smallmouth don't. But it is definitely a great point to say that there's science out there. Mm-hmm. I'm going to make sure that today when I, speak about things, that this is not confidential information. Anything that I refer to is out there. There's reports every year that are publicly available that give updates on the bait fish population. You can look up what the goals are for the fisheries managers, how they are trying to, sustain a healthy lake, create a healthy fishery for people to enjoy. Those objectives are widely available. I want to start off first with sort of a low-hanging fruit when it comes to Lake Ontario and something that a lot of people noticed. But before I do that, I want to say, whether you're seeing this on YouTube, listening to it on Spotify, please feel free, if you're a Lake Ontario angler, to submit some comments to me and just say, here's what I found last year. Because what I'm going to do is submit these comments to the next meeting that I have with these fisheries managers, so that we can have a voice and we can share our experiences. I really think that a lot of what's being reported on isn't reflecting geographically. Being a West End guy, and I consider West End anywhere from Port Credit all the way to the US border on the Niagara River side, our fishing is drastically different than that of Eastern tributary guys off of Coburg or Port Hope. The fishery is turning into something very different from one end of the lake to the other. And I want to discuss why I think that is and what we can do to reconcile this. So I had mentioned some low-hanging fruit. Lamprey eels. Wow. Last year, we saw a lot of lamprey eels, mature eels hanging on our lake trout, our Chinook salmon, even our steelhead and browns. And this was discussed at the Lower Lakes meeting. They had the lamprey guy who runs the program. And essentially what happened was in 2020, we had a lot of closures because of COVID, and they couldn't run the lampricide program in the streams. So what that means is that for a whole year, instead of killing whatever percentage of eels normally get killed by that procedure, they came to maturity because we missed a whole cycle. And there's a lot more about eels that I could get into, but I'm not an expert on eels. But yeah, basically, you know, you lose that year class and you see it within 3 years massively. So, you know, there's one thing that affects the fishery really fast. And now I think we're forced to play catch up because that's going to kill fish. Gill lice is another thing. They didn't speak about gill lice at the Lower Lakes meeting, but I know I caught steelhead, which were just riddled with these things. And they're really, it's so sad because you see the fish are really drawn. They're really skinny, and you can just see all the lice in their gills. And when they shake, they expel them. But man, like those are two things that within the last 2 years, now 66% of adult steelhead have these gill lice. And they weren't here before, at least not in those numbers. So like for me to learn the science behind it and to see the impact just within 2 years, it's pretty wild.
Did they have any procedures in place to deal with gill lice before, or is it something that's just invaded the lake?
You know, I thought it was interesting that it wasn't discussed because I haven't heard of anything that can be done about the gill lice. I know I've only ever seen them on steelhead. I don't know if they affect the other salmonid species the same, but I mean, the lamprey program, what's interesting about that is you skip a year and then in 3 years you see more lampreys than have been seen since before they treated them. And it shows actually the effectiveness of the program. And I think that's the silver lining to it is once they got back on track, once they could treat, those lampreys are going to go away. It just has to cycle out.
Yeah, it's amazing how much effort, infrastructure, and money is involved in treating the lakes for various invasive species and other contaminant issues. Like imagine back, well, I can say back in the day, but back before humans were really a presence in the lake, the systems just worked on their own.
Yeah.
Right. But now you have all these new species that are only here because of us that we now put so much money, time, and infrastructure into handling. And if we don't obviously put in all that same effort, it blows up even more, like the lamprey. So it should be a self-sustaining system, but it's so far gone from that point that when it comes to stocking and when it comes to the issues pertaining to what you can stock, it's all anthropogenically influenced. It's nuts.
Yeah, we have our fingers in a lot of pies when it comes to that. A couple things about that is, you know, we were talking about, you know, the whole argument of, well, we just need to put more fish in the lake. Well, could you imagine if you didn't know anything about lampreys and you dumped twice as many fish in and you didn't treat the lampreys, what that would do? Would it really be an effective stock? No, it
Definitely
wouldn't
not.
work. Everything has to work together. It's just so interesting, like you say, to think about how impactful uh, the managers of the fishery have to be in order for it to work.
Yeah, I caught a smallmouth this year as well with a lamprey on it. And I know I saw there's some cool underwater videos being posted by some different organizations now too. And one of them had a clip of a carp swimming around in deeper water, and you can see a lamprey stuck to its back as well. So it's definitely not just salmonids that are even facing the lamprey issue itself. Because I think the range that these lamprey can occupy is a lot more extensive, or at least overlaps with a lot more fish species than people think.
Right.
Literally, almost all fish are susceptible to them.
Yeah, it's one of those things that is unpleasant, and luckily the program was working really well before there was that break in the regularly scheduled programming. I think lampreys, like I mentioned, is kind of a low-hanging fruit. You know, we can understand that these parasitic eels are pretty immediate and abrupt impact. You know, when you catch one of these fish with one hanging off of it, you can really see the struggle that causes on a fish. Other issues, you know, like the bait fish talks, we as everyday anglers can't really understand that, other than if we cut open a fish and we see that there's a lot of bait inside, what size the bait is, or if there's no bait at all. But those discussions, I think, are sort of for a different, maybe a different podcast about the whole alewife situation. I think it could be summarized as it's a threat to a specific group of fish in the lake. And like I said, it's a discussion for another time. Another thing that I found from this lower lakes meeting that was extremely interesting was some of the research being done to understand how many fish are wild in our lake versus how many we stock, and understanding the population dynamics behind that. I know when we make decisions about where to stock and how many fish to stock, it is always amazing to think about, well, how many of those fish are returning and succeeding? Like certainly if you think about Port Dalhousie, where you and I both grew up fishing, fish run there, but they don't succeed.
Right.
And then there's beautiful streams along the lake's north shore where you could definitely see a fish succeeding at spawning there. So I guess from my point of view, I'm looking at things like we stock a lot of fish on the North Shore. We also stock fish on the South Shore. But a river's natural capacity to create more fish on its own year after year, i.e., wild populations, is a lot greater than the ability of us to stock fish.
Right.
You gave the example of, you know, if we weren't here, nature would continue on. It's very, very good at continuing on. So when these decisions are being made about allocating stocked fish, is the research there to support where we're doing that? And currently there's no data really about how much is wild and how much is like fish succeeding at spawning.
You know, there's the potential to have that data. I haven't read any stuff about it, but that's the reason you do fin clipping, is it lets you trace
Absolutely.
back specific fish to specific hatcheries. But it also works really well if you want to just do a basic mark recapture study. So if
Mhm.
you know, or if you go out fishing for, let's say, even a week, you keep track of how many fish you caught that had a fin clip, like were obviously stocked fish, and how many weren't. Well, you'd assume those stocked fish would be mixed in with the natural population. So your likelihood should be equal, or not necessarily equal, but you have a fair chance of catching one that's either stocked or not stocked.
Right.
If the proportion of fish that you're catching is overwhelmingly stocked with fin clips, then that immediately indicates to you that there's a lot more stocked fish than natural fish. Either that as a blanket statement, or the specific area you're fishing has more stocked fish coming to it for whatever reason, which is possible as well. Maybe these stocked fish don't know where they're going in the lake or behave differently than the natural population, right, and are therefore more likely to be exploited by anglers. That's a kind of variable you have to account for if you can. But for places that we fish like the Niagara River, where you oftentimes catch a lot of natural run steelhead, but you also see some ones that have fins clipped. Well, if you take a sample size, is like maybe you go out fishing 10 days, look at the proportion you caught each day, well, you can determine pretty quickly what percentage of fish are stocked versus not stocked. And I think if anglers pay more attention to that, you're very quickly going to realize a lot of these fish are stocked.
Mm-hmm.
I think of lake trout fishing we do from shore after the season opens in December, and so many of those fish have fin clips. I know you also see it on Lake Simcoe now with whitefish and lake trout. A lot more of those fish that you're catching have fin clips. If you're seeing fish that aren't clipped, that's a great sign. The fishery is still sustaining itself. But when you get to the point where almost every fish you're catching has a clip, it's great. The fishery still promoted that fish to get to that age, but it's also a little bit concerning because you have to think, okay, why are we not catching the same proportion of fish that are natural?
Right.
One other thing I have to say about stocking in that regard is there are some fish species that we still don't stock. Perch, bass is a big one that there's a big fishery for that we don't see any stocking for. And one argument I've heard a lot personally is regarding bass seasons and, hey, down in the States, largemouth bass seasons are open year round and they have some of the most remarkable fisheries down there. Why aren't they open year round here? You can make the goby argument doesn't hold up as well for largemouth bass nest predation because you don't have a lot of goby around largemouth bass nests. But the thing is, right now, we still have naturally reproducing largemouth bass populations in the States and all those reservoirs and almost all the water bodies that are known for being good largemouth fisheries in America. They're all stocked heavily with largemouth bass. So one of the reasons I'd say that we haven't had to do that here yet is because we still do have these closed seasons protecting the spawn. And it'd be interesting to see in the States is if you stop that spawning or if you stop that stocking, will you see those populations decline? And then it's another thing you have to have supporting evidence to make the claim that that's because they do bed fish a lot and transport fish around. But yeah, a lot of different things to consider in the realm of stocking, which species you decide to stock or not. And would we have better largemouth fisheries here if we stocked as well? Maybe, but then once again, you're changing the natural system and you never know what you're going to introduce even to the genetic pool when you're adding new fish to the system.
Such an interesting conversation to have. And I'm glad to have this platform because I think that you and I can both help bring science out of science and bring it to people. Like there's a good chance that someone who's listening to this is driving their car on their way to work right now. And they may not have had the background or the exposure to thinking through these kinds of issues with the complexity that someone like yourself, is used to thinking in because you are a science person and you are a fisheries person. I want to take it back. And I think it was 2017. I remember there was someone who started a derby and they wanted to catch and retain and kill lake trout because they said there's too many of them and we're worried about the bait and they're going to eat all the bait for all the salmon that we do want. So we want to have derbies where guys are going out and killing their limits of lake trout. And I remember at the time, the lake trout fishing was really, really good. And whether that was because of the year or because there was so many fish, I don't know what it was, but it almost seemed like, yeah, we'll never run out of these things. There's just so many of them. There's too many of them. And I listened to someone present at this Lower Lakes meeting, and they were estimating that the wild lake trout is less than 2%.
Wow.
Of the lake trout. And I know when we had that really good day recently shore fishing, I kept saying that's a stocked fish. That's a stocked fish. And before that, I never considered that lake trout were stocked and clipped. But that day I was like, holy smokes,
Mhm.
Look at the fin clips. They're all stocked.
Well, I think one really interesting
Crazy.
thing you touched on there is the salmon being the popular game fish that are in demand, and the lake trout being seen as subpar by these
Hmm.
anglers. Well, it's funny because lake trout are the native fish to this system, not the salmon, right? Like
Right.
lake trout have a place here naturally, and salmon do not. So it's mind-boggling to me that someone would be like, there's too many lake trout. We want to promote this introduced species that was only introduced to handle the alewife that appeared, and it was alewife, right? Not
Yeah.
shad. Yeah.
Yep.
So yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of backwards thinking. I understand that now there is more money behind the salmon fishery than there is behind the lake trout fishery, and that'll always drive different initiatives and research.
Sure.
But if you're just still thinking about it from a natural system perspective, it should be seen as a great thing that there's more lake trout than salmon. But I understand, yeah.
And now I think we can make the argument that we wish there was more lake trout. At least myself, like with the kind of operations that I do and the kind of fishery that I fish, um, I would love more lake trout. I had a discussion today with a captain, and it was basically like, okay, so how can you target lake trout? Can you jig them? Do you know how to jig them? And I said, well, I know how. I haven't spent the time doing it, but I think if I figured it out, it would be a lot of fun.
It would definitely be a lot of
It
fun.
would be a lot of fun. And now that there's live scope, like to me, that video game fishing out there is so cool. I've done a fair amount of it inshore fishing for bass, and it's cool too. But there's some places where when you do it, it's like, okay, this feels like cheating. But for lake trout, like if you see a bait ball and then you see fish going through the bait ball and then you drop your swim bait down and you reel it up and you watch them chase, like I don't think that'll ever get old. And I haven't
Yeah,
even done it yet.
I couldn't be bothered to troll for lake trout. I'm sorry. Even salmon's kind of pushing it for me.
For
I mean, no
sure.
offense, but if you're telling me, hey, you want to come out lake trout fishing, we're going to be jigging them up. I am going to be in that boat 10 out of 10 times. And same
Right.
thing with salmon too. I'd rather jig them than troll for them. But
Right.
but yeah,
So
that's a
there's
side.
a lot of questions about, who's driving who. Is the dog wagging the tail or is the tail wagging the dog? When it comes to industry and the intersection between fisheries management for a healthy lake and fisheries management for a healthy industry. And we are somewhere in the crux of that, both in the
Yeah.
position of yourself being someone who wants to have a career in fisheries management of some kind. I don't know at what level. I don't want to speak for your aspirations, but for myself, like being someone who's guided and who has a deep respect for the guys that have made a living from the lake, um, and myself wanting to do that as well. It's it's just so interesting, and I think we're at a critical time where we have to have this understanding, like what I talked about, have the understanding of the science, why things are happening the way they are, and then speaking up. For us West End guys, are we being treated fairly? Are things as good as they could be, or could they be improved? Um, and that's really the purpose of this discussion today and why I wanted to go out and do this. Thank you for tuning in to the Love of Fishing podcast. Once again, I'm your host, Lyle Gator, joined by
Victor Papaiz. Cheers.
he's here. And we'd like to thank you so much for listening today. I hope that you found this discussion thought-provoking. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel on YouTube and give us a follow on Spotify. I'm hoping to continue these discussions on both platforms, and it really helps when you give us a like, drop a comment. When it comes to comments, I'm looking for feedback. If you're a Lake Ontario person listening to this podcast, let me know what you thought about last year. Are you seeing the lampreys? Are you seeing the numbers of fish that you want, the size of fish? And I know as fishermen, we're always wanting more, but do things seem to be in check? That's it for this episode of the Love of Fishing podcast. Thanks again for tuning in. And don't forget to get outside and go fishing. Peace.